My fiancé disappeared for 2 weeks to enjoy his bachelor party, and when he came back, he was furious because I canceled the wedding. 16 days before my wedding, my phone turned into a tiny haunted house, buzzing and glowing and then going dead every time I needed it to do the one job it was built for. My name's Marin. I was standing in my apartment kitchen in the United States, barefoot on cold tile, staring at a calendar full of wedding errands and trying to convince myself the nerves were normal. The plan was basic: confirm the deliveries, pick up my dress after the last tiny alterations, and make sure the seating chart didn't start a civil war. And then my fiancé vanished. Not like, oh, he's taking a long shower, or he's in the car and the signal is bad. I mean vanished as in I called and got nothing. I texted and got nothing. I tried again and again until my thumb hurt. And the only thing I got back was that stupid little message that basically says, your call is going nowhere. At first I did the polite panic, the normal person panic. Like, maybe he fell asleep early. Maybe his phone died. Maybe he's with his parents and it's loud. But by late afternoon, my stomach had that hollow, floating feeling, like my stomach was dropping. I called his mother because I didn't know what else to do, and she answered on the second ring with the exact tone of someone who already had a script. She went, "Oh, hi, sweetie," like I'd called to chat, and I told her I couldn't reach him and asked if he was with them. She paused and then said she hadn't seen him since yesterday and that he was probably just busy, which was insane when your son is about to get married. I called his father next, and he sounded irritated. He told me to give it time, like this was a late pizza, not my whole life. By evening, I had called everyone who mattered. His best friend, the guy who was supposed to stand next to him, the friend who always makes jokes at the wrong time, even a cousin I barely knew. Nothing. Nobody answered, and the few who did gave me the same vague nothing. I haven't heard. He's probably fine. Relax. Relax. Sure. Totally. Let me just relax while I'm imagining him lying in a ditch somewhere like a tragic headline, yes. My brain went straight to the worst. I'm not proud. At around 4 in the morning, my phone lit up with a notification from a social media app I barely used anymore, and I almost ignored it because I was too tired to care. But the preview had one of his friends' names, and my body moved before my pride could stop it. I opened it, and there it was. A photo dump, bright lights, a crowded bar, drinks in the air, and my fiancé in the middle of it, grinning like he didn't have a wedding coming up and a fiancé losing her mind on a couch. The location tag said a party city across the country, the other side of the country. Not a neighboring town, not a quick road trip, not even a different state. A whole time zone away. I stared at the screen so long my eyes watered, and I remember whispering out loud, "You've got to be kidding me," like the room might laugh with me. I zoomed in on his face and I felt this wave of heat go up my neck, because he didn't look scared or lost or regretful. He looked carefree. He looked like the version of him I used to love at parties in college. The version who could shrug off responsibility like it was a jacket. Except this time the responsibility was me. So yeah, that's how those last 2 weeks before my wedding started. Me in sweatpants, smelling like anxiety, watching my fiancé party on the other coast while my stomach tried to fold itself into a knot. If you're wondering how I handled it, the answer is not well. By the time the sun came up, I had done what any sane person would do after finding out their fiancé ran off to the other side of the country without telling them. I turned into an amateur investigator fueled by rage and caffeine. I looked up the bar from the tag. I checked flight times like I was planning a rescue mission. I scrolled through every picture like it might suddenly reveal a hidden explanation. And I kept telling myself there had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe it was an old photo. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe he got dragged there against his will, I know. I was bargaining with the universe like a clown. But the timestamps were current, and the comments were even worse. People were cheering him on, calling it the best send-off, telling him to live it up. And there were little inside jokes that made it obvious this wasn't some spontaneous detour. This was planned. This was celebrated. This was a group decision that apparently didn't include the woman he was supposed to marry. I texted him anyway because anger makes you do embarrassing things. I wrote, "Where are you?" And then, "Are you kidding me?" And then, because I couldn't help myself, "Come home on the next flight, or there won't be a wedding." I sent it at 5 in the morning, and I immediately regretted the ultimatum because it made me sound like a cartoon villain. But also, what else was I supposed to say? Have fun, babe. Try not to lose your ID. Hours passed. 12 hours. More. My phone stayed quiet except for my mother calling me twice, which I ignored because I didn't have the energy to explain that my fiancé had apparently joined an out-of-state party tour. Finally, late the next night, he called. and the first thing I noticed was the background noise. Laughter, music, voices overlapping like he was still in the middle of it. I answered with my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to break free, and I said his name like a warning. He didn't even start with, "I'm sorry." He started with, "Okay, you need to calm down." Which, if you've ever been told to calm down while you're actively experiencing betrayal, you know it's basically gasoline. He said the trip was a surprise bachelor thing his college friends planned months ago, and he said it like that made it cute instead of insulting. He admitted he'd known about it a few days before leaving but didn't tell me because I'd overreact. He used that exact word, like my feelings were an annoying habit. He said the flights and the rental and the whole thing had already been paid for, and it was 2 full weeks. So, obviously, he couldn't just bail. 2 weeks. I repeated it back to him and he laughed like I was being dramatic for not finding that romantic. I told him we had talked about not doing that kind of thing, not disappearing, not turning the lead up to our wedding into some frat memory. He said I was controlling, and I swear you could hear his friends in the background going, "Oh!" like this was entertainment. He said he deserved a last experience before getting married so young. And then he hit me with, "You'll understand when you stop trying to manage everything." I didn't manage everything. I managed the seating chart and the bills and the communication and the emotional labor and apparently now the consequences of him acting like a teenager. I could hear you rolling your eyes from wherever you are, and you'd be right. Before I could even finish telling him what I thought of that, he hung up on me, and when I called back, it went straight to nothing. Later, I found out he'd blocked my number for a little while so I wouldn't ruin the vibe. I stared at my phone like it was the punchline to a joke I didn't want to be in. That's when the fear finally collapsed into something colder and sharper, because fear at least assumes the person cares. This was him choosing not to care, and everyone around him cheering for it. And I was sitting alone in my apartment, staring at our wedding date on a calendar like it was a prank somebody pulled on me. The next day, I walked through my life like a ghost, doing normal errands with this insane secret buzzing under my skin, and it was genuinely surreal. I went to the grocery store and picked up bananas like I wasn't secretly wondering if I was about to become the woman everyone whispers about. The one whose wedding got canceled because she couldn't handle a boys' trip. I answered emails from vendors with polite little exclamation points while my jaw was clenched so tight it hurt. I tried on my dress, and the seamstress kept telling me how beautiful I looked, and I kept nodding like a doll, because what was I going to say? Thanks. My fiancé is currently on the other side of the country pretending I don't exist. My parents came over that evening because my mother had finally gotten me to answer a call, and I made the mistake of telling her the truth. I expected shock, maybe outrage on my behalf, maybe my father saying he was going to call the other family and demand answers. Instead, my mother did this long exhale and said, "Well, men do stupid things when they're nervous." Like that was supposed to soothe me. My father asked if I was sure it wasn't a miscommunication, which is such a polite way to call your daughter gullible. I showed them the pictures, and my mother's face tightened, but then she went right into problem-solving mode, which with her always means, how do we make this look acceptable? She started talking about how close we were to the wedding, how much money had already been spent, how people would talk, how I couldn't just throw everything away because he went on a trip. I stared at her, and I felt this weird childlike panic, because I realized she wasn't worried about me. She was worried about the optics. Meanwhile, his mother started texting me little guilt bombs like, "He's just trying to have a little fun," and "He loves you so much," and "Please don't punish him." Punish. Like I was his mom taking away his game system. It made me want to scream. I called him again that night from a different number. Because yes, I did that. And no, I'm not proud I told you I'm not a saint. He answered, and I said, "Don't hang up." And he laughed and said, "Oh my God, you're being intense." I asked him if his parents knew, and he hesitated. Just long enough for the truth to slide out. They knew. They'd known the whole time. That's why his mother sounded so calm when I called. That's why his father told me to give it time, because they weren't worried. They were covering. It wasn't just him. It was a whole little team of people who had decided I didn't deserve honesty. I told him very clearly that I was canceling the wedding if he didn't come home immediately. He told me I was embarrassing him, and he said, "You don't want to be that girl who freaks out and ruins everything." Like my main fear should be being perceived as difficult. Then he said he wasn't coming back early because he'd spent a lot of money, and he wasn't letting me tell him what to do. That word again, like asking for basic respect, was dictatorship. When he hung up, I sat on my bedroom floor and stared at the hem of my dress hanging in the closet, and I felt this split inside me. Part of me wanted to cling to the plan, to the idea that love means compromise and forgiveness and working through things. And part of me, the part that had been swallowing little disappointments for years, stood up and said, quietly, "No, not this." The truth is, that trip didn't come out of nowhere. It was just the loudest version of who he'd always been when his friends were watching, and who I'd always been when I was trying to keep things smooth. I just didn't know it would blow up like this, right before I was about to legally tie myself to it. So on the third day, with my hands shaking and my stomach empty, I opened my laptop, pulled up the guest list, and I made the decision that would change everything. And yes, my hands were still unsteady while I did it, because being sure doesn't mean being calm. Canceling a wedding is not one big dramatic moment like in movies, where you run down an aisle in slow motion and everybody gasps. It's 1,000 small humiliations, it's spreadsheets and emails and deposit policies. It's you sitting in your living room writing the same sentence over and over, trying to make it sound less insane. The wedding is no longer happening. And it's you realizing, in real time, how many people are invested in your relationship as entertainment. I started with the venue, and I cried on the phone because the coordinator was kind, and I hated that she was kind, because kindness made it real. The cancellation fee was brutal, and I had to say out loud that I understood, that it was policy, that yes, I would pay. I called the caterer next, then the florist, then the person doing the music. Each call felt like ripping off another layer of skin. I could practically hear dollars evaporating, and in the back of my mind I kept thinking, I'm paying to be disrespected. Love that for me. Then came the guests. There were a lot, not because I'm some social butterfly, but because our families are the type that treat weddings like community events, like a public announcement of status. I didn't want to send a mass message because it felt too cold, but I also didn't have the emotional strength to individually explain it 150 times. So I did this weird in-between thing where I sent personal-ish messages that were still copy-paste. I told them he had disappeared for an out-of-state trip without warning, that he refused to come back, and that I couldn't move forward. I asked them not to contact him about it yet because I needed space to manage the fallout. And yes, I realize now that asking people not to gossip is like asking a toddler not to touch a puddle. Of course, someone told him. I found out because his best friend, the same one who'd ignored my calls, suddenly texted me, "He's upset. What did you do?" What did I do? That sentence sits in my brain like a splinter. I replied, "Tell him to come home." And the friend wrote back, "You're making this worse." As if it wasn't already worse. As if I had some magical dial I could turn to make betrayal more convenient. My parents came back over and tried to talk me out of it. My mother kept saying, "You're going to regret this." And my father kept saying, "People will talk." And I finally snapped and said, "People are already talking. They're just not talking about him." That shut them up for maybe 10 seconds. And then my mother went right back to the idea that I was ruining my own life because I couldn't compromise. Compromise. In their minds meant accepting disrespect quietly. His mother called me, and her voice was shaky in that performative way, and she said he was confused, and that he loved me and that he'd made a mistake, and I said, "He's still there." She went quiet, and then she tried to change the subject to my tone, to how I was speaking to her, to how I should watch my words. I laughed, actually laughed because I didn't have anything else left, and I said, "You lied to me on the phone while he was partying on the other coast." She said she was protecting him, and I said, "So you weren't protecting me?" And she didn't answer. That night, I sat with my laptop open, staring at the total amount I'd lost in deposits and fees, and I felt this sick mix of grief and rage. I wasn't rich. I worked a normal office job. I paid rent. I budgeted groceries. I saved for this wedding by skipping little pleasures like takeout and new clothes. And now all that money was gone because a group of grown adults decided my boundaries were inconvenient. It didn't. But for one night, at least I slept. And it wasn't peaceful sleep, it was that exhausted sleep where your body shuts down because it has no choice. And somewhere in there, under the panic, was this tiny, stubborn feeling of relief, like my future had just narrowly avoided a trap. He stayed the full 2 weeks. I know you already guessed that, because of course he did. The man who could block his fiancé to protect the trip mood wasn't going to suddenly become responsible because I asked nicely. He posted pictures like nothing was happening, and I watched them like an idiot, even though each one made me feel worse. I'd tell myself I was checking for signs of remorse, and then I'd end up staring at the background details, trying to see if there were women in the group, trying to read his body language like I was a detective in a bad relationship mystery. It's embarrassing, but I'm telling you because it's true. When he finally came back, it was 2 days before what would have been our wedding, and he went straight from the airport to my apartment like he was returning from a normal business trip. I know that because my neighbor texted me, "He's outside," and my stomach dropped so fast I almost gagged. I'd been bracing for that moment for days, but bracing doesn't mean you're ready. It just means you're tense while you wait to get hit. He knocked and I didn't open. He knocked again, louder, and I stayed behind the door like a kid hiding from a teacher. Then he started talking through the door, and it was so absurd I almost laughed, because he sounded like he was trying to negotiate a minor argument. He said, "Okay, let's just talk, and come on, and this is ridiculous." When I still didn't open, he shifted into guilt mode and said, "Do you know how much people are counting on us?" Like the wedding existed for the guests, not for the relationship. After about 20 minutes of this, I opened the door, but only enough to see his face and to make sure he could see mine. He looked tired, a little sunburned, carrying a duffel bag that probably smelled like airports and bad decisions. He smiled like he thought his charm would fix it, like he'd walk in and I'd melt because he was back. Then he saw my expression, and the smile faltered. I said, "It's canceled." The way his face changed was honestly the first satisfying thing I'd felt in days. His mouth fell open and his eyes got wide, and for a second he looked like someone had switched languages on him. He blinked and then he said, "No, it's not." Like he could just deny reality into submission. I told him I had canceled the venue, the vendors, everything, and I had told the guests. I said it calmly, which surprised me, because I'd imagined myself screaming, throwing things, being cinematic. Instead, I was just flat, like my emotions had burned themselves out. He started talking fast, tripping over his own words, saying he didn't think I'd actually do it, saying he thought I was bluffing, saying he was sorry and he'd make it up to me. He cried, not pretty tears, more like a panicky, messy collapse. And he reached for my hands and I stepped back because I didn't want his skin on me. That's when he got angry, because sadness wasn't working. He said I was punishing him, that I was being dramatic, that I was throwing away 5 years over one trip. He kept saying one trip like it was a weekend at a cabin, not an out-of-state disappearance with intentional lies. I told him he didn't just take a trip. He took a vote on whether I mattered, and he voted no. I leaned my forehead against the door and listened to him breathe on the other side, and I felt this weird ache in my chest, because even though he deserved the consequences, he was still someone I had loved. But love doesn't erase disrespect, and it doesn't pay back deposits, and it doesn't unhumiliate you in front of your whole community. Eventually, he left, and I sank onto the floor in the entryway like my legs had been borrowed. My phone started buzzing almost immediately, because apparently he went straight to his mother, and she went straight to my mother, and my mother went straight to the idea that I had embarrassed her personally. It was like a relay race of blame, and I was the baton. The days after he came back were this exhausting loop of messages, calls, and people acting like my boundaries were a group inconvenience. His mother called so much I started recognizing her number pattern without even looking. My father texted me long paragraphs about forgiveness and maturity, like he'd suddenly become a motivational speaker. My mother showed up at my door once without warning, and when I didn't open, she left a voicemail that sounded like she was crying. But the words were all about reputation, about what people were saying at church, about how I was making the family look unstable. I listened to it, and I felt this cold resentment settle in. Because why did nobody care about how unstable I felt when my fiancé vanished? He tried different tactics. At first it was apologies, long messages about how he loved me, how he'd been stupid, how he wanted to prove himself. Then it turned into anger when I didn't respond. He'd text, "You're really going to do this?" And then, "So you're just going to ignore me now?" Like he was the victim of silence, not the person who had weaponized silence by blocking me while he partied. His friends joined in, which was honestly the grossest part. I'd get messages from people I barely knew telling me to give him a chance and stop being dramatic, and I'd sit there thinking, why are you so invested in my humiliation being reversible? It felt like they wanted the story to end in forgiveness because that would make them less guilty for encouraging him. My job became a weird stage too, because of course the gossip made its way there. I worked in a plain office, nothing fancy, just a lot of emails and meetings and people pretending to be busy. I went in on Monday and tried to act normal, but my face must have been a billboard, because a coworker asked if I was okay in that overly sweet tone that means they already know. Then another coworker made a joke about bachelor parties, and I laughed like it was funny because I didn't want to cry at my desk. By lunchtime, I'd heard my own story told back to me in fragments. and not always accurately. Then my mother said the thing that broke something in me. She said, "You always have to make a point," like my backbone was a personality flaw. And I realized that in their minds, I wasn't a daughter who was hurt. I was a daughter who was difficult. They didn't want me to be safe or respected. They wanted me to be agreeable. His mother called again that night, and I answered because I wanted to stop the endless buzzing. And she said he wasn't eating, he wasn't sleeping, he was destroyed. I said, "He was fine across the country." And she gasped like I was cruel. She told me I was being hard-hearted, like I was supposed to soften so he could feel better. I told her I needed my money back for the deposits and fees, at least half, because it was his choice that caused this. She said, "That's not fair." And I laughed again, because I kept laughing when things got absurd, like my body didn't know what else to do whenever someone tried to rewrite reality. Not fair was my fiancé disappearing and making me pay to cancel. When I hung up, I looked around my apartment and felt this strange loneliness, because I had expected my family to be my team, and instead they were acting like I was a problem to manage. I sat on the edge of my bed and thought, maybe this is what growing up actually is. Not getting older, but realizing the people who are supposed to protect you sometimes just want you to be convenient. And yes, that thought made me cry, ugly cry, face in a pillow, because I wasn't just grieving a relationship. I was grieving the fantasy that the people around me would choose me when it mattered. A week after the cancellation, I started hearing the new version of me, the one my ex-fiancé was telling everybody about, and it was honestly impressive how quickly he turned himself into a victim. Suddenly, I wasn't Marin who got blindsided. I was Marin who wouldn't let him have friends. I was Marin who tracked his phone, which I never did, because I'm not a spy and also I didn't want to know that much. I was Marin who made him miserable, which sure, we had normal arguments like every couple, but miserable. That was news to me. At first, I tried to ignore it because I thought the truth would speak for itself. Cute thought. The truth doesn't spread unless you tell people yourself, and I was too tired to be my own public relations team. Meanwhile, he was out there, telling people I had issues, telling them I overreacted, telling them he had to escape for his own sanity. Escape? From what? From making a phone call and saying, "Hey, I'm going across the country for 2 weeks." One of my mutual friends, someone I'd known since college, called me and said, "He's saying you were abusive." Abusive. That word made my ears ring. I asked what he meant, and he said my ex was telling people I used guilt and ultimatums and that I isolated him. And I felt this cold nausea because I could see exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just protecting his image. He was rewriting our whole relationship so his betrayal looked like self-defense. So instead, I did something quieter and maybe more pathetic. I told a few people the truth in private, and I watched which ones believed me. It was like a friendship lie detector. Some people immediately said, "That's insane," and they stayed in my life. Others hesitated, tried to see both sides, and I felt this icy distance form, because if you can see both sides of someone disappearing to the other coast without telling their partner, then maybe you're not my person. My parents, of course, didn't help. My mother actually said, "Well, you can be intense," like intensity was the same as abuse. I told her, "You're buying his story because it's easier than admitting he lied," and she snapped that I was making her choose. But wasn't she choosing already? Then she did something I still can't believe, even though it happened. She gave me an ultimatum. She said if I didn't at least meet with him and talk like adults. I wasn't welcome at their house for a while because she couldn't handle the tension. I stared at her and felt this weird calm, like my brain had finally run out of shock. I said, "So you're choosing him?" And she said, "I'm choosing peace." Peace apparently meant me swallowing my feelings so everybody could pretend nothing happened. I left their house and sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying not to spiral. I wanted to call him and scream. I wanted to call my father and beg him to stand up for me. I wanted to call anyone who would tell me I wasn't crazy. So I blocked my ex-fiancé's number, not as revenge, but as self-defense, because my phone had become a pipeline for manipulation. I blocked his mother too. And when my mother texted me later asking why I was being extreme, I replied, "Because nobody else is protecting me." And then I turned my phone face down and tried to breathe like a person. The next morning I woke up and my first instinct was to check my phone, to see if the world had ended overnight, because apparently my brain thinks silence equals danger now. That was the moment I realized this was going to leave a mark, not just on my relationship status, but on my nervous system. Love that for me. Again. The days right after the cancellation were a blur of cancellation emails, awkward calls, and trying to get through work without crying in the bathroom. About 10 days after I canceled everything, I got an email from his friends, the ones who had been out of state with him, and just seeing their names made my chest tighten. The subject line was something like, "We're sorry," which is hilarious, because even their apology had a generic group project tone. I opened it anyway, because curiosity is my toxic trait. It was long, and it was written like they were trying to sound mature, like they'd all sat around and decided on the right words. And the more I read, the worse I felt. They admitted they had encouraged him to ignore me. And they said when he got nervous because I was texting so much, they told him I was just testing him. They wrote that phrase like it was a normal thing to say about a woman who was about to marry someone and couldn't reach him, testing him. Like I was a villain in a game show, not a person with a life. They said they told him not to come home early because if he did, it would set a precedent that I could dictate his choices. There it was again. The same dynamic they understood was dominance. They admitted they'd joked about me being upset and that they'd called me the warden, and I nearly spilled my coffee right there at my desk. Then they tried to soften it by saying they didn't realize how serious it was, that they thought he and I would laugh about it later, that they were caught up in the moment. But they weren't caught up. They bought out-of-state tickets. They planned 2 weeks. They told him to block me. That's not being caught up. That's being deliberate. I didn't even finish the email the first time. I scrolled down and saw the part where they started asking me to forgive him, and I slammed my laptop shut like it was hot. I sat there breathing fast, and this old familiar shame washed over me, because a part of me wondered if maybe I had been too intense, too serious, too no fun. That's what years of being told you're a lot does to you. It makes you question your own reality even when the evidence is literally glowing on a screen. Later, when I calmed down, I reopened it and forced myself to read the rest, because I needed to know what I was dealing with. The ending was exactly what you'd expect. They said he loved me, he was scared, he made a dumb choice, and I should consider giving him another chance. And they added this little line about how weddings are bigger than 2 people, like my relationship was a community property. I deleted the email and I didn't reply, and I felt this sharp clarity settle in. This wasn't just about a trip. This was about a whole network of people who thought my role in the relationship was to accept whatever they decided. I also started thinking about his family, how his mother would smile and compliment me and then casually undermine me, how his father treated everything like a power struggle. I used to think I could marry him without marrying all that, but now I realized I would have been walking into their system, and their system didn't have room for me to be an equal. I finally called a therapist because my friends were supportive, but they couldn't be my emotional dumping ground forever. And I needed someone who wouldn't say, just forgive him, because they were tired of hearing about it. In the first session, I sat there twisting a tissue in my hands, and I kept saying, I feel stupid. And the therapist said, you're not stupid, you're grieving. And I hated how true that was. Because I wasn't just grieving the wedding. I was grieving the version of my life I had already started living in my head. So yeah, I started therapy because a group of grown men treated my relationship like a prank, and my family treated my pain like a public relations issue. That feels like a very modern American origin story, honestly. I went through the motions for the next few days, numb and exhausted, just trying to get from morning to night. 2 weeks after the cancellation, the practical mess started, because breakups aren't just emotional, they're logistical. And logistics don't care that you're heartbroken. We still had months left on our lease, and I learned fast that fighting him would cost more than the penalty to break it. We had shared utilities, a shared credit card we used for wedding expenses, and a bunch of tiny subscriptions that kept putting his name next to mine like a bruise. I called him, through my therapist's suggested structured communication plan, which basically means I sent a calm message asking for a time to talk about financial separation. He responded hours later with, "Why are you being like this?" And then he said he wouldn't pay any of the cancellation fees because it was my decision. I read that line and I felt this spike of rage because, again, the way he framed it made it sound like I woke up and got bored and decided to cancel for fun. It was like he had no concept that actions have consequences unless the consequences were happening to him. I asked him to at least split the credit card balance, because it was both of us who benefited from the planning, and he said, "I didn't make you cancel." That was his favorite sentence for a while. He didn't make me cancel. He just made the situation impossible and then acted like my reaction was optional. In the end, I paid off the shared credit card myself over the next several months, because I needed his name out of my finances more than I needed to be right in the argument. I told his parents I needed to arrange a time for him to pick up his things, and his mother tried to put him on the phone, like she was running a hostage negotiation. I said no, and she said, "You're being childish." And I had to remind myself not to scream, because screaming just gives people an excuse to call you unstable. I told her I'd leave his things in boxes by the door, and she said I was cold, and I said, I learned from the best. Yes, I said it. It felt good for about 5 seconds. I went back to my desk trying to look normal, and my boss pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay because I seemed distracted lately. Not ideal. My life was collapsing, and the main concern was office mood. If there's a theme here, it's people prioritizing comfort over my humanity. At home, my mother called and said my father was so disappointed, and she asked if I realized I was breaking the family. I told her, he broke the relationship, and she said, but you broke the wedding. Like the wedding was the sacred thing, not me. Then she went further. She said if I didn't stop being stubborn, I shouldn't come to the house for Sunday dinner because it would be awkward. And I said, okay. And she sounded surprised, like she expected me to beg. I didn't beg. I was tired of begging. I hung up and I cried. But the crying felt different, less panicked and more like a release because if they were going to punish me, at least I wasn't going to perform for them. That weekend, I sat in my apartment surrounded by half-packed boxes because I'd decided I couldn't stay there, not with all the wedding memories soaked into the walls. I started looking for a cheaper place, something I could afford on my own without feeling like I was paying rent to a ghost. I scrolled listings, talked to landlords, did the normal adult stuff, while my heart kept doing this annoying thing where it would suddenly remember him and ache like a bruise pressed too hard. The therapist told me to write down what I knew to be true, like a reality anchor. So I wrote, he chose a secret out-of-state trip, he blocked me, his family lied, his friends encouraged it, and I canceled because I didn't want to marry someone who could treat me like an obstacle. I wrote it over and over until the words felt less shaky. And that's how I started rebuilding, not in some inspirational way, but in this messy, practical, angry way. One phone call and one box at a time. After that, the calendar kept moving, even though I felt stuck in place. 3 weeks after he got back, he finally showed up to collect his things, and he brought his father like emotional backup, which told me everything about how he planned to handle it. The night before, his mother texted me from someone else's phone, getting around the block, with this half-apology, half-warning message, saying they were sorry things escalated, and they hoped I would be reasonable. Reasonable. Like the unreasonable thing here wasn't a grown man disappearing across the US. I didn't want to be home when they came, because I didn't trust myself to stay calm, and I didn't want to give them a scene they could twist into a story. So I asked my neighbor, a sweet older woman who had basically adopted the hallway, if she could be there as a witness. She said yes, and she brought a little folding chair and set it by my door like she was ready for the show. I love her for that, honestly. They arrived in the afternoon. I heard the knock and my stomach flipped, but I opened the door with my shoulders squared like I was walking into a meeting. His father nodded at me without warmth, and my ex stood behind him holding empty boxes, looking smaller than I remembered. They didn't come in like they belonged there anymore because they didn't, but they did step inside like they were doing me a favor by being polite. My ex stood there holding a box, and he looked at me with red-rimmed eyes like he wanted me to rescue him from himself. He said, "Can we talk?" And I said, "Talk about what?" And he said, "About us." That word, us, felt wrong in my mouth. He started crying again, the same messy panic tears, and he said he was sorry, he was scared, he didn't know why he did it, he didn't think I'd actually cancel. I told him I needed the truth, not the performance, and he nodded like he understood, and then he said something that cracked the whole thing open. He started crying and told me the part that finally made everything click. He said that while he was still out of state, he kept thinking I might call it off, and that thought didn't scare him the way it should have. He'd been anxious for months about getting married, about feeling trapped, and he didn't have the guts to be the one to end it. When his friends pushed the trip, he went along with it because it gave him distance and a ready-made excuse. He said, "I thought if you ended it, then I wouldn't have to be the bad guy." I swear my whole body went cold. It wasn't just that he lied. It was that he engineered a situation where my reaction would do his dirty work. He sabotaged our wedding so he could escape without owning it. I asked him if his friends knew that, and he nodded. And he said they had been telling him for months that he was too young to get married, that he should have one last blowout, that I was too serious, and he let them feed his fear until it became a plan. He said his parents knew he was nervous and they thought the trip would help him, which is such a twisted version of help that I almost laughed. I felt this surge of rage so sharp it scared me, because it was cleaner than sadness. I said, "So you used me?" And he tried to argue. Tried to say he loved me. Tried to say he was just confused. But it didn't matter. Love doesn't cancel out cowardice. I told him he didn't just break my trust. He made me carry the blame for his exit. And then I said, "Get out." He looked like he wanted to say more. Like he wanted to bargain. But my voice was steady and he finally lifted the box and walked toward the door. His father came back in right as he left. And he asked if we were good. And my ex didn't answer. And I said, "We're done." And that was it. That was the end of 5 years in a living room with half-empty shelves and a neighbor sitting in a folding chair like a guardian angel with opinions. After he left, I thought I would feel instant relief, like a switch flipped. But what I actually felt was this huge, heavy grief, because his confession didn't just end things. It rewrote the whole past. It made me look back at every sweet moment and wonder if it was real, or if it was just him trying to keep the relationship afloat until he could escape cleanly. That kind of doubt is toxic because it spreads, and suddenly nothing feels solid. I spent that night sitting on the floor of my bedroom, surrounded by boxes, staring at the wall like it had answers. I kept replaying his words. Part of me thought you might call it off, and it hit me over and over that he had made me the villain in his story on purpose. He'd set me up to look like the bad guy so he could feel free. And people bought it because it's easier to believe a woman is too much than to believe a man is cowardly. The next day, I called my therapist and told her what he said, and she was quiet for a second, and then she asked me how it felt in my body. And I wanted to throw my phone because that question always sounds so annoying. But then I realized my shoulders had been tight for weeks, and suddenly they weren't. I told her it felt like clarity and nausea at the same time. She said, "That's your nervous system recognizing truth." And I said, "Great, my nervous system has better judgment than my ex." I tried one last time with my parents, not because I thought it would work, but because I needed to know I had tried. I went to their house and sat at their kitchen table, the same table where I used to do homework, and I told them what he confessed, that he had sabotaged the wedding because he was too scared to end it himself. My mother's eyes widened for a second and my father frowned, and I thought, maybe, finally, they'll understand. I said, "You care more about what people think than what happened to me." She got defensive. Of course. And she said she cared about me, but her version of caring was always conditional. It was like she cared as long as I behaved in a way that made her look good. I told her, "You're not on my side." And she said, "I'm on the side of family." And I said, "Then why am I alone?" My father finally spoke up and said, "Your mother just wants peace." And I said, "Peace for who?" And he didn't answer. That was the moment I realized my father wasn't neutral. He was just passive, and passivity always benefits the loudest person. I left. I didn't slam doors, I didn't shout, I just left. And I felt this strange floating sensation in my chest, like I was stepping off a ledge. In the car, I cried, because it hurts to accept that your parents might not be capable of giving you what you want. But when the tears stopped, there was a calm behind them. Like, okay, now I know. Over the next few days, I started cutting ties. I told my parents I needed space, and I blocked their number for a while because every conversation was just them trying to negotiate my boundaries like they were buying a used car. I stopped answering mutual friends who wanted updates because I wasn't a reality show. I focused on moving, on closing accounts, on paying bills, on doing the things grown women do when their life implodes and nobody hands them a manual. I found a smaller apartment across town, cheaper and quieter, and signing the lease made my fingers feel stiff, but it wasn't panic. It was adrenaline. Moving day was just a couple friends, some boxes, and a lot of forced jokes so I wouldn't cry. When I packed the last of my stuff, I shoved the wedding dress into a donation bag without even unzipping it, because keeping it felt like storing a ghost. The months after that were less dramatic on the outside and more brutal on the inside, because that's how healing works, apparently. People think moving on looks like you smiling in a new outfit with a new haircut. But for me, it looked like waking up in the middle of the night with my heart racing because I dreamed he was calling and I couldn't answer. It looked like standing in the grocery store and suddenly crying in the cereal aisle because I saw a brand of cookies we used to buy. And yes, I know that's ridiculous, but grief doesn't care if you're embarrassed. Therapy became this weekly appointment where I would walk in trying to be composed and then immediately start venting like I had been holding my breath all week. I talked about the trip, the lies, the humiliation, the money, the way my parents reacted, the way his friends acted like I was a cartoon villain, and the therapist kept bringing me back to this idea that my boundaries weren't the problem. The problem was the people who benefited from me not having boundaries. I had to untangle so many patterns, like how I'd been trained in my own family to keep the peace, to smooth things over, to be reasonable, and how that made me a perfect target for someone who wanted a partner who would swallow disrespect. I started noticing how often I apologized automatically, even when I wasn't wrong. I started noticing how I'd say yes to things just to avoid tension. It was like discovering my own software had been programmed by other people. Financially, it was tight. Those cancellation fees had hit my savings hard, and splitting the shared debt was a constant fight. He refused to pay, so I talked to a lawyer, not some big dramatic legal battle, just a simple consultation where the lawyer looked at my paperwork and said, basically, you can try, but it might cost more than you'll get. So I did the painfully adult thing, and I paid it down myself over time, because I wanted him out of my life more than I wanted revenge. Some days I hated that about myself, because I wanted him to feel it, but peace has a price, and apparently mine was interest rates. I also lost friends. Not in a dramatic way, more like they faded, because they didn't want to deal with the discomfort of choosing a side. They'd send a thinking of you message once and then disappear. Or they'd say, I'm staying out of it, like neutrality was moral. I learned that a lot of people prefer harmony over truth, and that's how bad behavior survives. I started doing small things for myself, not in a new me way, more like tiny acts of rebellion against my own sadness. I took myself to a movie alone and didn't hate it. I bought new sheets because the old ones reminded me of him. I invited friends over and let them see my messy apartment without apologizing. I went on a couple awkward dates, not because I was ready, but because I wanted to prove to myself that my life wasn't over. One date talked about himself for 2 hours, and I smiled and nodded and then went home and texted my therapist, "Is it too early to swear off humanity?" She replied something comforting, and I rolled my eyes. But I felt less alone. My parents stayed distant. My mother would send little messages on holidays like, thinking of you. But there was always this unspoken condition, like she was waiting for me to soften and come back and pretend nothing happened. I didn't. I couldn't. Not without losing myself again. By the time 6 months had passed, I wasn't healed, but I was different. I could talk about him without shaking. I could say my ex-fiancé without feeling like I was swallowing glass. I could sit in silence without immediately reaching for my phone like it was an emotional inhaler. And I know that sounds small, but when you've been living in constant emotional noise, quiet is a miracle. Almost a year after the wedding that never happened, I had this moment that felt like the universe checking in to see if I was actually moving on or just pretending. I was out with friends at a restaurant downtown, one of those places that tries to feel cozy but is mostly loud, and we were halfway through our meal when I looked up and saw him. He was across the room at another table with coworkers laughing like a normal person. And for a second, my brain did that stupid thing where it flashed back to us laughing together, and I felt this old reflex to soften. Then my stomach dropped, because my body still remembered the betrayal even if my mind wanted to be calm. I froze with my fork mid-air, and my friend noticed and asked what was wrong, and I just mouthed, him. My friends immediately offered to leave, to switch seats, to cause a scene, because they're protective like that. But I didn't want to run. I didn't want to be the woman who leaves every room he enters. So I stayed, and I forced myself to take a sip of water, and my fingers felt a little unsteady. But I kept breathing. Of course he noticed me. He stared for a moment like he wasn't sure if it was really me, and then he did this thing where he composed himself and stood up, like he was about to be polite. He walked over, and I could see his coworkers watching, curious like they were about to witness a reunion. He smiled, tight and careful, and he said, "Hey," like we were old classmates. I said, "Hey," back, and it sounded weird in my mouth. He asked how I was, and I said I was good, which was true enough in that moment. He said he was working on himself, and I almost laughed because that phrase has become this generic apology for men who realize their actions have consequences. He asked if I wanted to talk sometime, and I said no, calmly, and his face twitched like he didn't expect a hard no in public. He tried to soften it by saying he just wanted closure, and I said, I already got it. And I could see him flinch, because closure is easier when it's mutual, and this wasn't mutual. I wasn't there to help him feel better about himself. The whole interaction lasted maybe 2 minutes, and it wasn't explosive, it wasn't dramatic, it was just flat. He wasn't my person anymore, and I could feel that in my bones. When he walked back to his table, my friends stared at me like they were waiting for me to collapse, and I didn't. I felt a little shaky, sure, but I also felt this strange emptiness, like the anger had finally left and there was just space. Afterward, in the car, my friend asked how I felt, and I said, like I just talked to someone I used to know. And that was the most honest thing. It wasn't that I forgave him, it was that I didn't want him anymore. And there's a difference. A few weeks later, a mutual friend reached out and told me my ex was telling people he was trying to grow, and that I was still mad. And I remember sitting on my couch reading that message and thinking, I'm not mad, I'm just not participating. He wanted me to either forgive him or hate him loudly, because both options kept him central. Indifference removes the stage. That's when I really started feeling like I was getting my life back. Not because I was dating someone new or because my parents suddenly apologized they didn't, but because my emotional weather wasn't dictated by his presence anymore. I could have a good day without it being interrupted by rage. I could make plans without calculating whether I'd run into him. I could buy groceries without scanning every aisle for a ghost. And yes, I still had moments where I felt lonely, where I questioned everything, where I wondered if I'd ever fully trust someone again, but those moments didn't control me anymore. They were just weather, passing through. By then, I had built a new routine and convinced myself I didn't need any more information to feel sure. About 15 months after the cancellation, I got the confirmation I didn't even know I was waiting for, and it came in the most casual, gossipy way possible, because of course it did. I was getting coffee with a friend, someone who still floated around that old social circle, and we were talking about random life stuff when she hesitated and said, "Can I tell you something?" The tone alone made my stomach tighten. She told me that during that whole time zone away trip, my ex had cheated. Not just once either, but with someone in the extended group, someone they met during the trip, and it had been treated like a joke by the guys. She said there were other men on that trip who cheated too, including some who were already married, and the whole thing had been this ugly little bubble where they acted like being across the country meant consequences didn't exist. She said a bunch of relationships blew up afterward, and people had been quietly keeping score, like it was all just drama for entertainment. I stared at her and waited for the pain to hit, because I assumed it would, because cheating is supposed to be this dagger. But what I felt was relief, deep, validating relief, like my body finally unclenched in a way I hadn't even noticed was still clenched. Because if he cheated, then the whole uptight fiancé narrative was even more ridiculous. It wasn't me being intense. It was him being guilty and projecting. I told her I wasn't surprised, and she looked surprised at that. And I almost laughed because, girl, I've been living in this story for over a year. I know my cast. She asked if I wanted details, and I said no, because I didn't need to picture it. I didn't need the mental images. I just needed the fact. When I got home, I sat on my couch and stared at the wall for a while, and I thought about the night I found those photos, how my whole body shook, how I wondered if he was dead, how I blamed myself for panicking, and I felt this wave of anger, but it wasn't as sharp as before. It was more like a steady disgust. He let me believe he was missing while he was out there acting single, and then he came back and cried on my doorstep like I was the cruel one. I also thought about my parents, how they told me I was being stubborn, how they implied I was ruining my life, how they treated the wedding like a sacred event, and my feelings like an inconvenience. And I felt this heavy sadness because I realized they would never fully admit they were wrong. Even if I handed them proof, they would find a way to make it about my attitude. I didn't tell my parents about the cheating. Not right away. I told my therapist instead, and she asked me what I wanted to do with the information. I said, I want to feel validated. And she said, do you need their validation to feel that? And I hated that question, because it was true. And also, sometimes you want the people who hurt you to admit it. You want them to look you in the eye and say, you were right. It feels childish, but it's human. I did tell a couple friends, because I needed to say it out loud, and they reacted the way my family never did. They got angry for me. They said, he's trash, and I'm so glad you didn't marry him. And I sat there and let their anger wrap around me like a blanket. Yes, I know that sounds dramatic, but when you've been told you're wrong for so long, having someone be loudly on your side is like medicine. If I had stayed, if I had swallowed it for the sake of peace, I would have been married to a man who thought a trip to the other coast was a free pass. I would have been legally tied to his parents and their excuses, to his friends and their cruelty, to a life where my boundaries were always negotiable. And that thought, more than anything, made me feel grateful for the version of me who canceled everything while her voice wobbled, because she didn't know the future, but she knew enough. I didn't hear from my mother directly for a long time, which should have felt like peace, but it mostly felt like an ache that changed shape. 18 months after the wedding, that wasn't. My mother called me from a number I didn't recognize. And I almost didn't pick up, because unknown numbers feel like danger now. But something in me said it was her, and I was right. The second I heard her voice, my shoulders tensed like my body was bracing for impact. She didn't start with an apology. She started with this careful, hesitant tone, like she was walking on ice, and she said, "Hi, honey." And I said, "Hi," because I'm still wired to be polite even when I'm angry. There was this awkward pause where neither of us wanted to be the one to say the real thing. And then she said, "I've been thinking about everything," which in her language usually means she's about to justify herself. She said maybe she had been too hard on me back then, and she said she was sorry if I felt unsupported. If I felt. That little qualifier made my jaw clench. Because it's the classic non-apology where the focus is my feelings, not her actions. She said she did what she thought was right as a mother, and she wanted peace, and she didn't want me to throw away my life over pride. Pride. Like my boundary was ego. Then she casually dropped a piece of gossip like it was a neutral fact. She said my ex was engaged again to someone he'd met not that long ago, and the community was talking, and his family was acting like nothing happened, planning a new wedding like the last one didn't end in flames. My mother said it with this weird tone, half scandalized, half impressed, and then she said, "See, he moved on." I felt this flare of anger because it was so obvious what she was doing. She was implying I should feel bad, like I'd lost something valuable, like my choice had been a mistake. She wanted me to regret. She wanted me to come back humbled, to admit she was right to pressure me. I took a breath, and I surprised myself by how calm my voice was when I said, "I didn't lose him." She went quiet, and I could almost hear her recalculating. I said, "I avoided him. There's a difference." She tried to argue, of course. She said marriage is hard. People make mistakes. You work through things. I said, "He disappeared across the country, blocked me, cheated, and admitted he wanted me to cancel so he didn't have to end it." I said it like I was reading a grocery list, not because it didn't hurt, but because I was done making my pain sound more polite for other people. She tried to pivot, saying she didn't know about the cheating, and I said, "You didn't want to know." And that was the first truly honest thing I had ever said to her without softening it. She made a small noise like she was offended, and she said she always wanted what was best for me. I said, "You wanted what looked best." Another silence. Then she asked if I was coming to a family gathering next month, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so typical. She wanted to skip over everything and go back to the performance of family, where we pretend we're close. I told her I didn't know yet, and she said, "Your father misses you." And I said, "He can call me," because he could, he just didn't, and I was done chasing. So I told her the truth, the one that had been sitting in my throat for months. I said, "I'm not waiting for you to approve of my choices anymore." I said it gently, but it was firm. I told her I loved her because I do, in that complicated way you love parents even when they hurt you. But I said I wasn't going to shrink myself to make things comfortable for her. I said I'd be in contact when I was ready, and not because she guilted me, but because it was my decision. She started crying then, real crying, or maybe just shocked crying, and she said she never meant to hurt me. And I said, "I know," because I think she believes that. But intent doesn't erase impact. We ended the call awkwardly, with no big resolution, no movie moment, just this heavy quiet.